So as Raz mentioned, I'm interested in researching what happened in Western history when altered state of consciousness were practiced by large sections of the population. And so today I would like to focus on the Bacchanals affair, which is the name given to the repression of the people practicing Bacchic worship, the worship of the god Bacchus, in ancient Rome in 186 before Christ, which could be considered the first mass repression of people practicing altered state of consciousness in the West. So to start, I would like to ask all of you, if you wish, to close your eyes and imagine a timeline, and to start going back in the timeline from when we are now in 2013, all the way back to the Enlightenment, to the Renaissance, to the early Christian age, the Middle Ages in between, the early Christian age, the birth of Jesus, and 200 years further back in time. And here we are in the capital of the Roman Empire. You can open the eyes again. And you can look at the Roman Empire back then in the 2nd century before Christ, covered more or less the eastern and western shores of the Mediterranean Sea. And Rome, the capital, was a huge city of almost 1 million citizens, which was characterized by an incredible cultural richness. It was extremely culturally diverse because it comprised people coming from all the different areas of the Roman Empire. So we had Egyptians, Phoenicians, Macedonians, Etruscans, and all of them would speak Latin with their different languages, their different accents, like now we speak English with our different accents. And all of them would be more or less free to practice their own religion, to practice their own worship, and also to be free to practice other people's worship. There was this religious tolerance, and which would be one of the main characteristics of this phase of the Roman history. So I would like to focus in particular on one of these imported cults, which was the cult of Bacchus. And so to focus on the cult of Bacchus, I would like again to make this imagination game. And I would like to imagine that we are in the middle of the night, and we see all of these people, like an incredibly variety of people, walking in the street with torches in their hands and disappearing into private houses. So we see men and women, we see younger people and older people, we see Romans and foreigners, and we see slaves and people belonging to higher level of society. So they disappear in private houses. They disappear in private houses, and we start hearing the sound of music. And it's a music mainly based on percussions and drums and flutes, and the music gets louder and louder and faster, and we start hearing people chanting and singing and really going for it, and we can feel that they're dancing. And at some point we can also hear that sex is involved. And it goes on and on until the break of dawn, when we would see this kind of scene of people holding each other, going back home after a very intense night. So we just witnessed a bacchanal from the outside. What did a bacchanal from the inside look like? The thing is that people participating to these rituals, they had to observe a strict vow of silence. So they were not allowed to speak about what happened during the rituals. So we don't have any direct report of what happened. What we have is images like this. And we have more mysterious, also this one, dancing and singing, more mysterious images of initiations, like this one. Or this one. These images, I don't know if you've ever seen them, they come from the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii, and they describe a Bacchic initiation, but without an explanation. So these are more mysterious images. So what we know is also that these spiritual practice belonged, it was like a Roman version of a very long spiritual practice that dates back to the primitive cult of the goddess of Mother Nature. And this spiritual practice consisted in techniques able to induce powerful altered state of consciousness. So these techniques would include dancing to repetitive beats, trance dancing to fast music, would include ingestion of mind-altering substances, which could be very different ones, and specifically in the Bacchanals, the wine that they would drink. Bacchus was the god of wine, but it's not the wine that we drink today. It was always a mixture. The wine would be also made with a different process that made it stronger than our wine today, and it would be a mixture of different psychoactive substances, including probably crushed seeds and leaves and roots, and we also don't have the recipes like the witches' recipes. We don't have them. We can imagine what plants would be used. So, trance dancing, ingestion of mind-altering substances, and sacred sexuality. These would be the three main techniques of ecstasy, which would come from primitive times and which would be used in a combination in the Bacchanals. The altered state of consciousness would be a way to enter into communion with the one, to enter into this experience of feeling oneness with Mother Nature. And so, for example, also the word orgy comes from the Greek orgazein, celebration of zoe, celebration of life energy. In fact, also Wilhelm Reich called his vital energy orgon energy, the same word of orgy, the same word of orgasm. So these rituals would be celebrations of life energy and would be celebration of oneness with everything. So this primitive practice permeated Greek culture into the form of Dionysian worship. So Dionysus was the son of the goddess. He was also the god of nature. He was also god of wine, god of ecstasy, god of love. And his, like here we can see Dionysus as the son of the mother goddess, and the rituals became Dionysian rituals. His worship, in a way, took over, because we are also entering the patriarchal age. And so his worship took over the worship of the mother goddess. But still, at the beginning of the worship, his rites would be performed by women only. This is a beautiful 18th century interpretation of an after party. And then rituals opened to men. This is a funny picture. I'm sure that the contribution of men to Dionysian worship, to the development of Dionysian worship, went way beyond chasing girls during the rituals, but this is a funny image. And so then Dionysian worship really took over and became one of the most practiced of the mystery religions during the Hellenistic phase. Especially, it became extremely popular, and from this point of high popularity, where many people practice these rituals, it was imported into Rome. And so Dionysus became Bacchus, and his rituals became the Bacchanals. So I would like here to make a little comparison to what is happening today with the urban ceremonies of ayahuasca. So in the same way, these are rituals coming from abroad, and so also the perception for the Romans would be to perform something that comes from abroad. These rituals would be semi-legal, semi-illegal, because also in the Roman times, Bacchic worship, the Bacchanals, had been imported in a non-official way. So Bacchus was never officially introduced among the Roman pantheons of god and goddesses with official celebrations. It kind of went in the culture because so many people started practicing. It was like a grassroots movement. And it spread like an epidemic, they said, spontaneously. And so this this edge between legal and non-legal And also, like today, you could find amazing leading groups, amazing priests and priestesses, and you could also find charlatans. It would be up to who you know to end up in the right ceremony. So, I drink some water. So the cult became so successful that at some point it became like a parallel city in Rome. I'm talking about Rome. It became like a parallel system, like a parallel group of people running in the city. They would have their own independent monetary funds, and they would have their own independent justice system, because they would have their own rules, and who broke the rules would be judged by an independent justice system. So it was also characterized by these people being connected among them by a very strong bond. They shared the belief in egalitarianism, for example, because the rituals were open to men and women, slaves and members of high families, Romans and foreigners. And they shared the belief in creating spaces to break social conventions, because the Bacchanals were spaces to break social conventions, a bit like our modern festivals are. So they shared a bond that was a transcendent bond, and it was a stronger bond that connected than the one connected them to the Roman government, which was a political bond. So we can imagine that at some point this phenomenon reached a size that it became very dangerous for the government. And the Roman Senate, in that time Rome was a republic, the Roman Senate, which was very conservative, moralistic, and also adverse to illegally imported cults, at some point they decided that it was time to re-establish order. So how was this done? We know about the story of the repression of the Bacchanals mainly by one source, which is Titus Livy. Titus Livy is probably the most famous historian. He wrote about 2 centuries after this, so more or less around the birth of Christ. And he wrote the book Ab Urbe Condita. It's the book talking about the story of Rome since its foundation. And in his book, he dedicates a whole chapter about the repression of the Bacchanals. This is how we know about this story. So he explains how, the story is complicated, and I invite you to read it if you have time and interest. But to make it short, he describes how the consul Postumius, one of the members of the Senate, managed to convince the whole Senate that the Bacchanals were hiding what we would call a conspiracy against the Roman government. So the Senate made a resolution, a new set of very strict laws concerning the Bacchanals, and then Postumius called a public assembly to explain to the Romans what was going on. And I would like to read from the words written by Titus Livy of what Lucius Postumius told the people about the Bacchanals. Citizens of Rome, if I lay bare the whole story, I'm afraid that I may spread excessive alarm. Whatever I tell you, my words are inadequate to the horror of the situation. Our energy will be devoted to taking adequate measures. So this is a fine rhetorical strategy. He hasn't even started to say anything and already people are scared. So the Bacchanals, he explains, have for a long time been performed all over Italy and in Rome. I'm sure you are aware of this by the bangings and howlings heard in the night, which echo throughout the city. And I want to say here that still today, in the Latin languages, we have a word for loud noise and confusion, which is baccano, which still is the same root as the Bacchanals. It comes from them. So some believe it's a kind of worship of the gods. Others suppose it to be a permitted sport or relaxation. And more than 2,000 years, we're still with the same question, I think. And so some suppose that it involves only a few people. But I tell you that there are many thousands of them. No, but if I tell you that there are many thousands of them, you're bound to be scared to death. A great part of them are women, and they are the source of this evil thing. I'm so proud now that we are the source of this evil thing. Next are males, scarcely distinguishable from females, dancing frenetically, having lost their minds by lack of sleep, by the confusion, by drink and the shouting that goes on through the night. So women had leadership positions in the Bacchanals. They were priestesses, so they could initiate men. And this was a total subversion of the patriarchal order of Roman society, so it was very scary for the Roman Senate. And men dancing, they were considered to lose their, to having lost their dignity of males and the soldiers more than anything. So also dancing males in these parties were something to be judged in a very negative way. So citizens of Rome, he continues, do you feel that young men initiated by this oath of loyalty should be made soldiers? Will they take the sword to fight to the end in defense of the chastity of your wives and children? So like now the issue of security is used to make pressure on public opinion. And they use the most delicate point. They say, if other men come to rape your children and your wives, you think that these dancing pussies will be able to help? That's the point. I can tell you that in Italy, still men have huge problems dancing. They are traumatized. So Postumius describes the Bacchanals as a place of indecency and crimes and all the worst things that you can imagine happen there. So he says, when the will of the gods is an excuse for committing crimes, there comes into mind the fear that in punishing humans, we might be doing violence to something divine. But men of deepest insight in all matter of divine and human law, the experts, have come to the conclusion that suppressing the Bacchanals will be done with the favor and approval of the gods. So if you're thinking that there is anything sacred here, don't think it. These are all a bunch of criminals, and we will suppress them with the blessing of the gods. So what he is doing is actually a crime in the name of the gods. But this is often in history, these kind of things happen. Then the resolution of the Senate, known as the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, this is the name of the law, was read aloud. Now, a copy of this law had been found in 1640, so about 400 years ago, in southern Italy while excavating to make the foundations of a house. And is this Postumius talking? So this is what it looks like. So this is a copy of the law that was found in South Italy, because the law was then copied in bronze and then sent everywhere in the Roman Empire. And so this is a proof that the story told by Titus Livy is true, because until now, the story of Titus Livy was the only source for this, for the story of the repression of the Bacchanals, and now we have the proof. So the law says, the priests of these rites, males and females, are to be sought out in Rome and in the whole Italy. No one should ever attempt to celebrate these ceremonies anymore. With an exception, and this is a very important point. If any person regarded such ceremonies as allowed by tradition and believed him or herself unable to forego them without being guilty of sin, he or she is to make a declaration to the urban praetor, which is the local authority, and the praetor would consult the Senate in Rome, attended at least by 100 members. If the 100 members give permission, then he or she is allowed to perform the rite, but with not more than 5 people, without common fund of money, without president of the ceremonies, and no priest. So private worship was still allowed, but still with going through an incredible jungle of laws, of bureaucratic rules. So this is the end of the discourse of Postumius to the public assembly, and then Titus Livius goes on to tell what happens after. After the end of the assembly, the whole city was in extreme panic, which spread throughout the whole of Italy, as letters were received from friends telling of the decree of the Senate. And here we can see again the bond connecting the people, writing letters to the other worshippers of Bacchus. They're coming, they're after us, hide, escape, they're gonna kill all of us. The following night, many people were caught escaping and were arrested. There was such a flight from the city that it resulted in a depopulation. Many names were reported to the authorities, because then the spies started talking and the neighbors denouncing each other. Some of these committed suicide. Those who were found guilty of Bacchic worship were condemned to death. All Bacchic shrines were destroyed. So, what is behind the repression? The repression was a political move that was aimed at removing from the political scenes certain people that were starting to have the numbers to overrun the government. There is an interesting question here. So these people that were the leaders of this movement, were they already belonging to the movement, or did they infiltrate the movement, taking advantage of the social cohesion that is a consequence of the spreading of altered state of consciousness? When a group of people share an experience of altered state of consciousness, one of the consequences is this bond that is created among the people. So this question has no answer, and I also just leave it there as a question. The repression also legitimized the state authority over religious matters. And this is a very important point in this historical phase, because also it legitimized the Roman Senate to decide whether or not a cult could be performed. And so it was like a message to the allies to say, we are empowered to decide whether or not you can worship your gods. And this is a big show-off of the male power of the Roman Senate. And so what is the message of today? What is the message for today? So today many people tend to project their story on the repression of the Bacchanals. We have women calling this story the first witch hunt, because they see that this was the first mass prosecution of people, and specifically directed against the women's authority over religious matters. So women call it the first witch hunt. And then the rave scene and people practicing altered state of consciousness, also they can project their story on this event, because they can also feel the victims of the government political agenda. Also, there is other people that have been using the Bacchanals to tell their own stories. We have this one. Now I stay with this one. So I think what is important to notice is this separation between us and them. There is the people practicing altered state of consciousness, and there is the people witnessing them from the outside. And there's these two factions judging each other and using politics to make war. So from the perspective of someone practicing altered state of consciousness, there is no separation. There is not us and them. So my question is, how can we use this knowledge to overcome the separation and to create unity? And another important point is the element of sacredness of the practice of altered state of consciousness. Not even the Roman Senate, that was in such a rush to stop the cult and kill everyone, not even them they dared to stop the practice, a practice that was considered sacred. So this long spiritual tradition has been interrupted by these and many other repressions that came later. But now it could be resurfacing, as this conference could be an example of the fact that this practice is actually resurfacing. And now it's resurfacing, finally free from any specific religious tradition, which I think could be seen as a positive outcome of all these repressions that actually created this effect that now we are free from religion. We are free to practice altered state of consciousness without a religion structure around it. And furthermore, this practice is resurfacing with the potential of being a rediscovered tool to come in touch with what is sacred, which is the unity of all things. And this is my end.